First, we welcome Dr. Bailin Shaw, Dean of California State University, Fullerton, College of Communications. We also welcome Dr. Carolyn Thomas, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at California State University of Fullerton. And last but not least, Dr. Brooke Barnett. She is the Provost of Butler University. Welcome this powerful panel, and Nika, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anitra, and thank you to everyone for being here. I think the first question I'd like to start with is this one. How did your life's journey, including your academic and other professional experiences, lead you to an awareness of systemic racism in higher education? And maybe there is an illustrative example that you could share. And I think, Dean Shaw, I'd like to direct this question to you to kick us off.
So I think for myself, growing up in an immigrant family, I came to the United States when I was 2. We lived in Salt Lake City, Utah. I was the only non-white child in my elementary school. Later, we moved to Houston. Again, I was the only non-white child in my kindergarten class. I think that experience of standing out and of being different really has shaped my approach to a lot of the issues we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that provides a nice framework for context to get us started. Provost Thomas, would you like to share your thoughts on that question? How did your life's journey lead you to become aware of systemic racism in higher education? And are there any examples you could share with us today?
Yeah, so I was that white child in the classroom with all the other white children in Southern California. And it wasn't really for me until I got to college and eventually took a class in American Studies where I had that moment where I was studying, redlining, the role of policing in Southern California, and suddenly understood my parents who'd come from the Midwest, both working in law enforcement and the courts, that in a lot of ways, my middle class Southern California story was the story of what happens with white privilege within a system of systemic racism. So I still think that when I went to grad school as a white person, I sort of thought of as working on race as not my work. I would even say sometimes I was advised that as a white PhD student. That's nice, but don't work on that. That's not going to get you a job. So I think for me, it wasn't until I was at the university as a professional and I'd taken on my first administrative role. And at that point, I brought this perspective from the faculty to the director of admissions one day. And I remember telling him, a lot of our faculty think that we used to have really good students and now we have more students that are struggling and they're wondering, like, what is admissions doing? What's wrong? And I remember him telling me, okay, we're bringing talent from California. And because of systemic racism, these students have not had the access to preparation. So if the faculty are amazing, probably they should understand it's their job to teach them. We're writing the system that is premised on inequity. And that was the moment where I thought, okay, it's my work. Let's go.
Absolutely, absolutely. Provost Barnett, can you tell us a little bit about your life's journey, your academic and professional experiences that led you to this perspective? And are there any examples you'd like to share with us today?
Thank you, Dr. Logan. I think part of it begins with the background that others have already talked about. So I hold really all majority identities except for being a woman. And honestly, the older I get, I think gender plays in a less negative way in terms of the way I'm perceived and the way I experience sort of maybe gendered behaviors. I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky, an evangelical tradition, religious tradition, and early on, at least in public schooling and in my church, identified individual forms of overt racism and saw those as issues of fairness. but did not piece any of those together into systems, or even systems that I, heaven forbid, was participating in and benefiting from until I was fully an adult. So really post-college, undergraduate for me was the first time I was understanding the role I was playing in those systems, and that was beyond those individual overt forms of racism, which were easy to feel righteous indignation about, not see the way sort of my majority identities were participating in. For me, in the higher ed context, it was beginning work, some work as a journalist that I think was helping me understand the systems that were pushing these inequities and isms in society, but working in higher ed now at 3 predominantly white institutions, and understanding and seeing the way Black and brown students were trying to maneuver those pieces, and seeing those opportunity gaps, and the ways often in those institutions we were placing the blame on the students themselves rather than on our own feet. And so understanding ways to better advocate for students helped me to understand the systems that were perpetuating what was difficult for those students, and also how I was benefiting from those students.
Thank you.
So for those systems, benefiting from those systems. Also, I was benefiting from those students too, but.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much for those 3 unique perspectives on your life experiences and how they've shaped your beliefs in terms of the of systemic racism. I'd like to build a little bit more on the conversation that Provost Barnett really opened up here, and talk a little bit more about the university as a system. How would you define the university as a system? And Provost Barnett, since you so eloquently spoke there, let's return to you again with this question. Can you talk a little bit about?
I'm going to quote my colleague, Dr. Shaw, and a fabulous article that I think has been really helpful, Broom and Shaw from 2013, looking at the system as their definition, which is a set of interacting units that endure through time with established boundaries. They respond and adjust to change pressures from the environment, but they really work to maintain and achieve sort of certain goal states, and really to reinforce, I think, status quo as well. And they nicely articulate in that article that systems can include all kinds of things, but classroom procedures, pedagogical practices, what's taught in the courses, the way we teach the courses, the way we set up the complexity of the curriculum, the unwritten rules that are part of a university system and culture, admissions processes, just all of the things that make up what we do in a university are those things that can be systems. So if you never get the chance to quote sort of one of the people that you read and admire and be in a webinar session with them. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. And the other thing I'll say about that is that often these systems don't ultimately serve our strategy in multiple ways. And they many times are the things that get in the way of the strategy and block our progress in a lot of areas. And I think in anti-racism work in particular, that's really noticeable. So that sort of change resistance of the system, and also even making explicit the parts of the system that are really invisible and sort of unknown, and articulating those. So you add in the system level piece, and then in the case of anti-racism work, this idea of the benefits of the status quo, the people who are benefiting from the system as it currently is, the personal and politicized nature of some of this work, and some defensiveness that can really happen, particularly from majority groups when you're talking about these conversations. All of that together, I think, really creates kind of some of the blockages that really make it hard for us to move through some of this work. I've always enjoyed Ibram Kendi's way of thinking about racism and anti-racism, rather than these like permanent labels that are put on people or processes or actions, to really just ask the question of, is this system serving an anti-racist function? And if not, why? And ergo, if it is not serving an anti-racist function, and we know racism is systemically part of the environment, then it is furthering and perpetuating the racism that's already built into the environment.
Absolutely. Provost Thomas, would you share a little bit of your thinking about the university as a system, and how we might begin to think about using anti-racism as a means to critique that system, change it?
Sure. As someone who changed institutions not too long ago, I would just add, the system is the thing. When you go to a new institution, everybody tells you like, this is just the normal thing. Everybody wants to give you advice, right? Oh, meet with this person, talk with that person. Oh, this is the official way you do it. But if you don't have coffee with these 3 people, that's not going to work. That's the system explaining itself to you. right? And I think the anti-racism work in that it's important to think about how in a system of higher education, because of the great system of tenure we also have people who've come into that system at really different periods of time, right? Someone who entered 20 or 30 years ago is literally not doing the same job in their mind as someone who's entering today. So I think a big part of anti-racist work is making sure you're thinking about that, and that you know that if you want to make space for people who have entered more recently, especially people of color, you have to create the opportunity for that voice to be heard. And you, in whatever leadership role you have, right, which is really just about influence, you need to take the action to make that space. Otherwise, the system will just keep itself at its point of stasis.
Absolutely, because of course, systems love to perpetuate themselves and maintain that stasis. Dean Shaw, you've had just so many fantastic thoughts about the university as a system. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm actually going to quote someone who was an interim provost at San Diego State my last year there. And this person, Dr. Joe Johnson, said in a meeting once, and I just thought this was so profound. He said, every system is perfectly designed to produce whatever outcomes it's producing. And at first blush, you think about that and you're like, oh yeah, of course, every system's designed to produce what it's producing. But then when you really think about that, you're like, oh. And as administrators, the provost and I sit in a bajillion meetings where we wring our hands and about the outcomes and how the outcomes need to be different. If it's true, and I think it is, that every system is perfectly designed to produce the outcomes it's producing, then that means to change the outcomes that we find unacceptable, we have to change the system that is producing those outcomes.
Absolutely. It's kind of frightening when you put it that way, thinking about the system as perfectly designed to achieve certain outcomes. And then you think of the devastation of some particular outcomes, particularly when we're talking about race and racism and doing anti-racist work. Universities are such big places, such big systems. I wonder, Dean Shaw, if you could talk to us a little bit about when and how you first became aware of a piece of the system that was outside of your classroom, beyond your department as a faculty member. How did you first, move from seeing this big, vast system to seeing individual pieces?
So I recently recorded with a colleague from San Diego State, Dr. DJ Hopkins. I recently recorded a podcast on inclusive academic leadership. And I'm happy to share that out with participants after this call. As a grad student, I first became aware of the system that operates behind the classroom by working as a graduate assistant in the study abroad office. And I talk about it in that podcast, so I won't spend time here. As a faculty member, I first became aware of a part of the system that was this division of student affairs. There's this whole massive part of the university that runs education programs for students outside the classroom, that offers support services to students outside the classroom, that offers residence halls. And I discovered that when my family and I lived on campus in a residence hall, and I got to interact with students and basically demystify the professoriate for them. Like, yeah, professors have to do laundry. And yeah, professors have to deal with their screaming toddler who always decide to throw a tantrum in the lobby of the residence hall. And that made me realize, as naive as it sounds to me today, that experience made me realize, oh my gosh, my students have a whole entire life outside my classroom. So maybe teaching my class and assigning the work as if my class was the only thing of import in that student's life, maybe I need to rethink my approach.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those insights. It's something I try to remind my students of too, like, yes, I have a life, and then also try to be thoughtful that they have lives too, that they're not all at home just dying to think about and talk about PR theory. This is as exciting as I find that. Okay, Provost Thomas, can you talk to us a little bit about how you first became aware of a piece of the system that was beyond the classroom or beyond your department as a faculty member?
First, I want to just say what Dean Shaw shared is so true. And I think, you know, when you're first teaching and at least when I came out of grad school, I had no idea how to see the institution from a student's point of view, how to even imagine the way their day was arranged, how many hours they spent on things, what student affairs was offering them, I just had no idea. And so I laid all kinds of things on them, like they were mini grad students. The system to me became visible when I first started as the undergraduate advisor in my department, American Studies, and we didn't have many majors. And so my job was to figure out why. And the collective wisdom was, you know, well, we need to redo our curriculum and we need to fix our website. But then one day I was at this meeting of advisors and I was talking with one of them and I was telling them about American Studies. And they said, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Do you want to come to a group of advisors? I was like, what's an advisor? What's a professional advisor? I don't know. So I went to the group and then they said, do you want to talk to the admissions people? And I was like, admissions people, who are they? And then it turns out that we as academics are reliant on a vast network of people who are not faculty to tell the story of what we do. And we have to have a compelling story of what we do with students. That's when I started to understand that we were not in this alone. And in fact, we needed to ask questions about how we were viewed and what students were looking for from us, from experts who are not academics.
Yes, thank you so much, Provost Thomas. That leads me to my next question, and I'll direct this one to you, Provost Barnett. As a provost, what system elements do you wish faculty better understood? Maybe talk about some things you think faculty may not be widely aware of, like faculty senate and how that makes a difference in the university system, and how faculty might be able to engage these individual system pieces in order to facilitate positive, meaning fair and equitable changes and perhaps transformations in the university.
Some of it's picking up on what Provost Thomas just said, just the idea of the way this is all interconnected. If we're thinking about the student experience, there's a lot of pieces of that go beyond the classroom and academic engagement part of a student's experience. And frankly, students don't know what part of the university they're engaging with. This is their experience, and they don't know if we're in enrollment management or in student life or in, you know, an academic staff position or in a faculty role. And I think that's true in some ways about the colleague experience as well, that we come in and experience the whole environment, and you know that those things are connected. I guess I'll first begin with the idea that faculty, if this is mostly a group of faculty, there's so much power in the faculty role. And I think sometimes there's an assumption that the change agents on campus come from sort of administration. But if you think about key areas that the faculty can work collaboratively and cooperatively with administrators, but basically faculty have to have the magic fairy dust to do the work. And so in shared governance, faculty have the most control in these couple of major areas that really influence the campus. And so what you teach, the curriculum, how you teach and your pedagogy, and who you hire. Those are things that are firmly grounded in the faculty side of the shared governance piece. And obviously administrators can say, we can't afford that curriculum that you came up with, or there are some intersecting laws about the way you teach and what happens in your classroom and perhaps discriminatory practices. And there are times when we are sort of shaping the type of colleague you can hire or approving positions, right? So there's administrative pieces in that, but so much of that really happens in those spaces is really faculty driven. So thinking about the power in the peer-led efforts among other faculty to revitalize the curriculum, to make sure it's relevant and culturally responsive, to pay attention to unnecessary curricular complexity and what that means in terms of equity for students going through the curriculum, to lead efforts toward evidence-based and inclusive pedagogy, to hire amazing colleagues who can help create the capacity to carry the water with you and to work collaboratively with you and deliver on the promises that we need to make that we have made to our students students and sometimes aren't delivering on, to make a great work environment, right? Like all of those things together. So those are areas I think that can really move the needle on a campus that are firmly in the area of the faculty. And I would just say, I think I can speak maybe for all of us here, as administrators, we want to support those peer-led and sustainable efforts and to get people working on those shared goals. We want to work together. And I think the adversarial posture kind of really hurts what we can do together. I do want people to point out from their vantage point what I'm missing, how I'm understanding it. But if we cannot start from the place, you know, that we are at a place of distrust from the very beginning or in an adversarial role. My greatest example of that is I had led the faculty senate at my previous institution and shifted into an administrative role right from that position. And it was like the blinds had shut. And I literally was leading the faculty, you know, advocacy space. And then I moved into working in the president's office, and it was like I'd moved to the dark side. There's jokes about that, but it does function in really real ways that I think actually harm our ability to work cooperatively. The part I think faculty sometimes and staff, non-administrators, I guess, don't always have is some of the financial understanding. Some of it's the vantage and the view, and sometimes it's that you're just seeing like some part of what's happening in a larger piece. But often, right, faculty are saying, how could you, you know, you spent this amount of money on a fountain in the middle of campus, and you could have instead given us all raises. Not to mention that, of course, the fountain is a one-time expense and the raises are ongoing permanent expenses, and the fountain was paid for by a donor who didn't want to give, you know, money towards this other issue. Or if you divided up the cost of the fountain by everybody on campus, it would be a one-time bonus of a very small amount of money. I mean, just all of those kind of financial realities. And then the other piece is that we are running organizations, and organizations have to run on business-like principles. And I do a lot of what I do in this job is business-like stuff. And that's just the reality of it. And that I want to free up other people to have the financial resources and the strategic direction and the support to animate their great ideas. But ultimately, I do have to be responsible for running a well-run organization. And so some parts of that mean that you're not going to be able to do what you want to, or I'm not going to be able to support what you'd like to have happen. And I think that's a vantage point that I don't expect other people to have, but I want maybe that understanding helps sort of understand I've got to think about consistency. I've got to think about prioritization. I have to think about creating things that we can sustain. And those are less fun, but also I think it's sometimes a view that others in the university maybe don't have that vantage point.
Yes, thank you so much for those rich insights. I really appreciate what you said about faculty empowerment, because sometimes faculty don't feel empowered, but then also about collaboration, and then also about breaking down all of the various responsibilities that administrators in your level have to think about daily, but may not be readily apparent to faculty in our day-to-day roles. But through collaboration, we can both understand each other's positions a little bit better. Dean Shaw, if I may, I'd like to return to you and ask, what elements of the system do you wish faculty understood better?
You know, listening to Provost Barnett, I had so many ideas. I finally had to start taking notes and write them down. Honestly, I wish the part of the system that faculty understood better was the faculty themselves. Because faculty are part of the system, right? And so sometimes you do get this, the system is doing this to me, or the institution is doing this to me, or you are employed as a faculty member by the institution. You are part of the system. And so, as Provost Barnett said, you should feel empowered to participate fully as a member of that system, right? You know, to the point about the us versus them and the going to the dark side, which I got a lot of when I took this position as a dean. You know, I always say, this is not the dark side if you bring the light with you.
That's a word.
And if you are a faculty member whose heart truly is about serving the students and not just kicking back with this cush tenure job, if your heart is truly for the students, then don't you want to bring that light into a position of influence? Because I can guarantee you that if you don't come over to this side with your light, there are plenty of other people out there who will take these jobs. So think about that. And I would also say to contextualize the demonizing of elements of the system. When you look at the literature on anti-racism, divide and conquer is one of the oldest tactics in the books, plural, across multiple cultures, for how the powerful stay in power. So if we as system change agents want to shift who gets to be in power, broadly speaking, then we need to be united in that effort and to recognize who we are truly fighting and what we are truly fighting. And what we're truly fighting against is ignorance and not each other.
I mean, I just want to stand right. Like, yes, all of that. Just pausing and reflecting on, it's not the dark side if you bring the light with you. How can you be a systems change agent? Being thoughtful about what we're really fighting for, what we're fighting against, and just so many gems were dropped right there, Dean Shaw. I really appreciate that so much. Provost Thomas, I think Dean Shaw has given us a terrific bridge to talk a little bit about diversity and its role in anti-racism. Do you have a definition of diversity that sticks out to you that you could share with us today? And would you mind talking a little bit about your own positionality and how that fits into the work of anti-racism?
Yeah, thank you. I'll kick us off. Diversity is a term we use all the time, right? But diversity doesn't refer to a person. Diversity is a word that refers to a group or a system, right? So we seek a diverse system in which we work. We seek a diverse group of our faculty. And for us at my institution, because it's a regional comprehensive, we also have to understand that that's not like a project we start today and then we're gonna be done, right? Because the diversity for us is about reflecting the communities we serve, but the communities we serve are in some ways always in transit, and that's part of the job. And so because back to that system where, right, this relies on tenure, our faculty have a role in the structure and point of privilege, it's important for them to understand how to use that role in an appreciative way, not in a combative way, though it can be in an intense appreciative way. But back to that system, we're always going to be working to diversify our faculty, our students, and our staff, because the doorway to the institution was built long ago. And people who know how to find it often come from families where there has been access and power. So I think that's really important for us to know, because it's not a strategic plan for 3 years. And I think on the side of, you know, my positionality and what informs that work. So for me, it is personal. I am the only white person in my immediate maid family. So I am aware of my whiteness, and I'm aware of the kind of privilege that it gives me, because I understand what happens when I go in a store versus when I go into a store with my son. Using that in the institution is key. While I am in this role, I can help this campus shift towards a reflective place where it reflects our communities, where we address anti-Blackness. And I can use the doors that open for me to do that, right? And then the next person who comes into my role, let's hope that that person can be anyone, but they're not going to be the person who has this job simply because they're African American or they're Latinx. They're not going to be the one the institution waited for. And I think that just means I have to embrace that, understand my privilege, and walk towards discomfort. Because there are a lot of folks in our institution that want change to happen quite quickly, right? And I have to sit in it with them. As a large institution, it moves slow, but it requires bursts of passion that we make space for and change.
I love that. Burst of passion can sustain us, you know, they really, really can. And if we have enough of those bursts, we'll get to where we're trying to go. Provost Barnett, would you talk to us a little bit about how you see diversity, how you might define it, and then maybe go a little further and tell us a bit about your own positionality and how that fits into the work of anti-racism.
Sure, and I mean, I like the way you're defining this. All of the things that were just said, of course, thinking about the ways in which we leverage our different identities, backgrounds, and experiences towards the benefit of having a diverse environment. And that, you know, there is, I still think in many predominantly white institutions, at least, this notion of we want people of a lot of different backgrounds to come together and act exactly the way that people who are already here. And so if we think that, you know, a diverse background doesn't change us, we're missing the point of having, you know, these forms of diversity together across a lot of different dimensions. And I think we always have to pay particular attention to marginalized historically or contemporarily identities within that experience, and where those voices are going to be really important. So I appreciate the way that's been framed and talked about. I think an overlay to this, of course, is just these values that we think about in terms of positionality, that no matter who we are, we have to understand the way who we are impacts how we're perceived and in these systems, as already been noted. But thinking about these values and overlays: fairness, trust, equity, authenticity, you know, those core values can matter to us as leaders across all of these pieces, and have a way for us to think about the ultimate goal that every member of our community is valued, respected, and has equitable access to opportunities, but that their voices, perspectives, and backgrounds and identities come and make us better. So, you know, I always think that we have these institutions where we say, here's what we are, we want to jam people into what we are, or here's what we are, here's what we could be, here's how we co-create that thing that this organization can be, which is constantly redefining itself. So in the end, I think racism is a barrier to all of those goals that I just described, those values. And so as we work to dismantle it in our community, that is core and central work, not it would be nice work. We can't get to the goals that we just described unless we're dismantling those barriers along the way. And if our goal is to provide a student's, you know, a stellar student experience and to be a great place to work, racism is one of those blockages that is stopping us from being able to do those things. So I'm aware of my visible, known, and not known identities and how I'm perceived in spaces, but also the way I need to model and walk the walk that I'm trying to talk about those values that I just described.
So well said, Provost Barnett. Thank you very much. Dean Shaw, I'd like to turn attention to you and ask if you would talk to us a little bit about how you define diversity, talk about your own positionality. You did that at the top a bit, but maybe you would expand upon it now and talk about how that fits into the work of anti-racism.
So I think one of our challenges, generally speaking, and I've actually written about this, is the manner in which we talk about diversity, not we on this panel, but we in our society. The manner in which we talk about diversity has been corrupted. Yes. Diversity in a neutral sense means just that, a bunch of different types of stuff within a collective, as Provost Thomas said, right? Diversity describes collectives. We have corrupted the term diversity to essentially be a PC stand-in for non-white. And that's a problem. So like when I see job announcements that say diverse candidates welcome, I already know I'm not interested in applying there because their understanding of diversity is actually not aligned with where I am in my own anti-racism journey, right? If we insist nationally as a people, if we insist on defining diverse as non-white, that means we are excluding white people from the conversation. And I'm so grateful to Provost Thomas and Provost Barnett for being here today and sharing their perspectives, because the fight for anti-racism is a fight that requires all of us, including white people, right? Including people from other majority dominant groups. And so I just think we should be really cognizant, each of us in our daily lives, with how we use the words that we use. And in that way, we can bring about incremental change.
That's so well said. Hopefully, so well said, Dean Shaw. Thank you so much. I do think that when we define diversity in the way that you described as a PC term for non-white people, it works against the work of the collective, which is to benefit all. And I think it's one of the things that leads to diversity not getting the level of wider spread support that perhaps it warrants. And along those lines, I'd like to stay with you for a second, Dean Shaw, and ask you another question. And that is, DEI is continuing to attract attention. It's a focus of the news media. It's a focus of public policy and legislation, for example. Why do you think resilience is an important part of advancing DEI as a means to address systemic racism?
So maybe this is stating the obvious. Resistance is necessary because, as Provost Thomas said, this is not a 3-year strategic plan to a solution, right? Systemic racism, at least in this country, began in the 1400s, right? This has been going on for centuries.
Right.
And it's exhausting. I'm exhausted, and I'm less exhausted because I have more privilege than many other people who are listening on this call, right? So this is hard work. It's tiring work. And so resilience is necessary because we are in this work for the long haul. And while I have the soapbox, can I say one more thing about resilience? I'm also sick and tired of hearing the word resilience lauded as something positive. Because what that does is it places the onus on the individual who is having to be resilient. A better conversation that I would like to hear is not about how wonderfully resilient XYZ individuals are. I would like to hear a conversation about the system that is perpetuating a problem that requires individuals to be resilient to survive on a day-to-day basis. Let's talk about that.
I think we found the subject for our next panel. But thank you. No, that was just wonderful. Provost Barnett, would you elaborate on Dean Shaw's perspective there? Would you talk a little bit more about this idea of resilience and why it's necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what you're getting is the idea of people have to bear the onus of and the ill effects of systems they did not create that are also targeting their experience. And so I guess an overlay on this to add to what you're saying, which I agree with all of it, is it's hard work no matter what. And there's a lot of people who prefer not to see these changes, and that's going to make it even harder. And it's much harder for some than others. And the current polarization and politicalization added another layer of difficulty. And I think two pieces to sort of note is this is a forever unfinished agenda, and it can feel like a quagmire. So I think finding ways to balance the notion that there's much more work to do with celebrating the wins big and small, and some effective communication around that's important. I like Provost Thomas' idea of these bursts of energy for these long-term things, and particularly systems that take a while to change. If you can dodge being part of this project because it feels like there's, this is just the place to go for good ideas to die, and people are going to keep churning and nothing's going to happen. I just think a lot of people will sort of tap out and be on the sidelines of that. So what's it like to get people feeling like they're engaged in part of the project, to be realistic about the progress that's happening along the way, but to not make it seem like we're only focused on the great things and we're not realistic about the challenges ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about leadership. And I'll begin with you, Provost Thomas, if that's okay. And I'd like to ask, how do you define leadership? And what advice do you have for faculty thinking about leadership roles?
Leadership, it took me a while to understand this. I might have just come to fully understand it yesterday in a meeting with Dean Shaw. I'm working on it. But really, right, leadership is about influencing people. I think previously I had thought about leadership as sort of using the point from wherever you are to affect change. But I think that if you go a step further and think that leadership is about influencing other people, and then using Dean Shaw's ideas, but I think that they're so clear, right? To do work of some sort. So I think leadership requires both understanding that your job, especially as an academic, it's to quiet the voice in your head that got honed all those years of study, right? And where you're like, I have the answer. You're gonna throw my hands up. I have the answer. And to understand that, it great, you have an idea in your head. That's not though the thing that comes out. Leadership is knowing how to hold that, pay attention to what's going on around you, and think about, if this thing in my head I believe to be true is true, why don't I listen and see what's going on here? And first of all, how would I need to express this or ask a question or make a space for someone else to feel invited in to that way of thinking? And second, how many draft revisions have I been willing to do of this thing in my head? Because the answer should be many before you're going to have something that in effect was influence. This is so different from the like, who wants to be class president model of leadership that we grew up with, right? Oh, Andy wants to be class president. Everybody just voted for him because he has candy in his lunchbox he gives out every day. It's a big change for us to absorb just what leadership means within a society that we acknowledge doesn't think like we do. But then to layer on top of that academic leadership, I think many of the lessons we learn that get us jobs and help us publish are counterproductive to actually leading in an institution for change.
Wow, I really appreciate so many of your comments there, especially the thought about leadership as inviting, right? Inviting people along. We think of leadership as being follow me because I'm the leader. No, I think it's exactly as you said. It's about inviting. And then also, I think another thing, another trick our brains play on us in terms of leadership is this idea of, okay, got a brilliant idea, good, one and done, but it is ongoing work, right? So I really appreciate the way you contextualize leadership there, building on the insights from Dean Shaw, who I'd like to direct this question to. How would you define leadership, and particularly in a public relations context? And what advice do you have for faculty that are thinking about leadership roles, pursuing them in the future?
Yeah, so I'm going to put a quote in the chat and we'll follow up after this call with references. I think I'd like to focus our time on the advice that I have. The question, the prep question that you sent us, Dr. Logan, was specifically, what relationship advice do you have for faculty thinking about leadership roles? And my relationship advice is this: work on your relationship with yourself. We have all seen what happens to systems, to organizations, to countries when the leader is somebody with some personal self problems. Because if somebody in a leadership position doesn't have a secure attachment to themselves and a strong grounding in their own identity, what we see sometimes is an enactment of leadership that is about bolstering that individual's ego. We've all seen this.
Yes, we have.
And that does nothing for institutions, and that certainly does nothing for changing the system, which is what we're here for today, right?
Yeah.
So I would say if you really want to participate in changing the system, the most important relationship you have is the relationship you have to that self, and being fully cognizant and aware of what that relationship is so that you can figure out your role in the system, and from whatever place that is, whatever space that is, make the system better.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I know that we'd like to leave time for questions, so I think I'll just ask one more, and I'll direct that to Provost Barnett. And I'll ask, what role should the university play in dismantling systemic racism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit what I referred to before. I think this is just about the success of students and our colleagues in an organization. And I just think it's foundational to flourishing and thriving individually and organizationally. So I see this work as a moral imperative, right? It affects learning, retention, student outcomes, quality of work life, sense of belonging, mental health, well-being. All of that is diminished by racism. So, That's just the big goal that we're working to. What practically do we do to do that work? Some things are actually fairly simple changes. If you're getting reports that aren't disaggregated, you're missing a whole bunch of what's happening on your campus. And frankly, sometimes you have the retention report and then you have like the diversity retention report. It's the retention report. That's information that's disaggregated and together. It's part of your practice. So take that disaggregated evidence and then say, what are we doing about this? Staggering thing I learned, I'm embarrassed to say yesterday, so I'm gonna keep on learning all the time. We had a fabulous speaker that was here from Vanderbilt talking about inclusive pedagogies and shared that, you all may already know this, 8% of schools have parity across racial groups for their retention and graduation rates. Another way to say that, 92% of us do not. My own school does not. That gets me up every single day, making a better reality than that current reality. That's a moral imperative. It's also, by the way, a financial imperative for our institutions, but the driving force should be that moral imperative.
Absolutely. While folks populate the chat with questions, I will then direct that question also to Provost Barnett. What role do you think the university should play in dismantling racism, systemic racism?
I think if you imagine, what is the purpose of the university in the biggest sense, right? So one, we have a society that requires us to have a certain amount of knowledge between the state of being in high school and choosing one's future path, and the ways that we provide that education lead to those possibilities. But it's also an age. It's an age in which, while we have students of all different ages in the institution, the predominant group is between 18 and 23. Those are the ages at which we as individuals and socially, we are responsible for taking what has been inherited from adults and seeing ourselves as the adults who then have obligations going forward. So I think that gives the university a very important place, right? When I was 20 years old and understood redlining and what it meant for real estate values and what that meant for generational wealth in Southern California and what that meant literally for my family. The house my mom bought in Torrance for nothing that she sold, that she bought in another city and sold. What didn't happen for Black families, what didn't happen for Latinx families. That changed my life. However, I learned that lesson from all white people. Those were my faculty. So why did I feel in class like I could learn that lesson and be supported in that lesson, have a voice in that lesson? So as an institution, we also do not get to take a pass on ensuring that the faculty in that classroom can teach that lesson and can push that lesson to where it has to go, right? And it's a moral obligation. And I would argue the future of public investment in what we do depends on our ability to turn this into a positive, inspiring, productive, and happy process that we lead for society.
Absolutely. That was so well put, Provost Thomas. Dean Shaw, may I ask you to reflect on that question as well and talk about the role the university should play in dismantling systemic racism?
I think the provosts have basically answered it all, and they have a much broader system view. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pass.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. All right, terrific. I see a question in the chat from Ross Holman, and I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. So I'll read it aloud and look forward to our panelists' thoughts on the question. So Ross says, I was too young to understand the situation at the time, but I grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. I've learned recently that I went to a school in one of the first busing programs where children of color were brought into my elementary school to diversify the student body and provide more chances to more students. Historically, are you aware of any positive outcomes that have come from programs like this? In parentheses, it absolutely made me more aware and experienced with broader life experiences. What do you guys think of that?
There's a lot of literature actually on school integration and the positive outcomes. So, and I'm not an expert in that area, but absolutely the literature on that is clear. The most recent literature in that subject area has actually shown that economic diversity in schools, in elementary schools, raise the mobility and eventual economic status of the lower economic status students in a mixed economy environment, right? So the literature started with racial integration, but now what we're seeing in that literature, that body of work, is the economic integration. But it's all clear that the more diverse the elementary schools are, the better the academic outcomes, the social outcomes, the eventual life and career outcomes are for all of those children. And so you juxtapose that to what we find in higher ed.
Mhm.
One of the things I learned when I was a faculty in residence is in the residence hall that I was a faculty member residing in, the students who moved to that residence hall, the majority of them had a roommate, and for the first time in their lives had to share a room. And the first time in their lives had to share a daily thing with somebody racially different from themselves. So clearly in the pipeline, there's some, and we can go on about this all day, vouchers, privatization, homeschooling, blah, 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 blah. What was historically set in place in the 60s has been eroded, and we in higher ed are seeing those negative outcomes today.
Absolutely. Provost Thomas, would you elaborate?
Well, that was so well said by Dean Shaw, but I do just want to emphasize there's some things in the chat. There's a lot of great work on this. At the same time that so many great things happen from it, right? Let's go back to the resilience thing. The requirement that in order to improve a system, we need to have Black and brown children, Black and brown adults, make a sacrifice, go through an experience, make it better by leaving their home area, not being able to play after. All of those things are also in the literature, so it's a fascinating story. But I think the part to stress is what the findings are, is that it's not the socioeconomic gain, the lifetime benefit is not only for those children, it's the majority population, right? The gain is for everyone. And so for some of us in this work, it's good to remember this literature is out there. This finding's already been booked, right? And we need to tell our story better, because this question that was asked is one that I think many people have, right? What happened with that? How did that go? Right? It was a resounding success, but it relied on resilience. In some ways, we're still there.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, we're still there. Very well said. Provost Barnett, do you have any thoughts on Ross's question?
I put in the chat just an article I had read recently. I quickly Googled and found, but it does give a pretty nice, journalistic summary of some of those studies, which is helpful. This is something I've always found to be interesting because one of the well-known Supreme Court cases around busing is from my home state, from Kentucky, and how that played out in Louisville, Kentucky. And frankly, the way things changed when there was a determination that the busing could no longer happen there. I do want to just put the fine point on where the onus sometimes does lie, despite all these outcomes. The reality of what we're doing is little kids are getting up really early and taking long rides to different places to go to school. And there are tremendous benefits from that, but it does really show how, again, sort of a system through redlining and several other things have created the funding of schools by property taxes, have created a system that does require that benefit to be borne out in some really challenging ways practically for families. And so just wanted to note that piece of it.
All right.
And just historically, let's observe school integration was a little Black girl going to a white school. Why wasn't school integration done with a little white child going to an all Black school?
That's a profound question. That is a very profound question. And I'll be thinking about that. In the time that we have left, I'd like to close with this question that focuses on PR education a little bit, since we're race in the PR classroom. And that question is this: how should PR educators educate to dismantle systemic racism? And I open it up to any of our panelists who'd like to take that question first.
So I guess as the PR educator, I'll jump in. We talk in public relations about what our field really is, and our field is about building and maintaining relationships between organizations and the people impacted by organizational decisions. To build those relationships, we have to enact internal changes to the organization. It's not just talking about stuff. We got to actually change stuff that we do, right? And align the walk with the talk. That's what real public relations is. It's not just communicating externally, it's fixing stuff internally. And when you take that understanding of our academic discipline into the broader work of anti-racism writ large, people, this is our calling. This is what we should be doing. And different academic disciplines, I'm sure, will approach it in their own way, but this is our entree point, I think.
Absolutely. So well said. So well said.
I'll add I'm not a PR person, but I'll add a layer just to thinking about, I guess, what we talked about before, which is what you teach and how you teach. So on the what you teach, I think it's the backwards design of where is racism and anti-racism occurring in the profession and the discipline, and how do you make that more seen and integrated and infused into what you do? So I think it's the backward design of what are the learning outcomes specific to anti-racism content, and then how do you go through and layer in course content, pedagogical practices that help deliver that. And the pedagogical practice is about, no matter what you're teaching, you want to teach to all the learners in your space effectively. And that can be true no matter what your content is. So I guess I would just put a push for student learning outcomes that, you start from what am I trying to do, and then you back into what's the best way to achieve that in a classroom context.
Absolutely.
These are really great comments, right? Reverse engineering from the audience back to the system is the challenge of our lifetime in higher ed. Understanding what is the audience outside need from us, who are they, understanding they are our students, and if they're not, they ought to be. And then how do we shift the institution? And it starts with, how do we even know what the audience wants? How do we use communication, build that bridge? And then how do we make something real inside the institution? Because you can't just talk, right? The audience is too critical and too smart for that, and they need us too much. So I think that in the PR classroom, just don't doubt that you're the epicenter, right? And use your faculty status and some of the things we've been talking about really to make the change and be comfortable that you're doing the right thing and making that change. Look for ways that what you do in that classroom also can get you on a Senate committee. You can maybe step forward into a leadership role. I benefit working with Dean Shaw on a regular basis in the ways that she shows up in a room as a public relations professional. And as you saw today, those kinds of framings that she does, the way that she puts intense thought into something and then delivers it in a 2-sentence that you can use, that is a critical skill in higher education that we need. So if you feel called to find yourself in a dean or provost seat, please don't delay. We need you.
Thank you.
Awesome. How awesome. Sorry, Nika. We're at the top of the hour, and I just want to thank you all, the audience, for being here and being a part of this informative and impactful session. I would also like to thank Dr. Thomas, Dr. Barnett, Dr. Shaw, who was integral in putting this together, and of course, our amazing moderator, Dr. Nika Logan from the PRSA Educators Academy, for just making this an amazing call and webinar. There was a link dropped for a survey. Please click on that link and share your thoughts and feedback with us. Also, join us, register for the next episode of Race in the PR Classroom, which will be on Thursday, October 22nd, starting at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Our topic will be how Hispanic and Latinx scholars and practitioners strengthen PR. Thank you all again for being here and have a wonderful week.